Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. And we're in Matthew chapter 27, and I'm going to read verses 43 through 50. And in this passage, Jesus says the only thing that he says in Matthew's Gospel. The only words of Jesus from the cross are mentioned. And of course, these are mentioned in the Gospels, that Jesus says this phrase in the other Gospels. So let's read this. So the people were hurling insults at Jesus, and I want to read verse 43 because it is a direct quote from Psalm 22. Psalms don't exist in chapters, they're songs. In Psalm 22, verse 8, he trusts in God, let him deliver him now. If he takes pleasure in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers also who had been crucified with him were casting the same insult at him. Now from the 6th hour darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, this man is calling for Elijah. And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. But the rest of them said, let's see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. So the robbers and the chief priests, they're hurling this particular insult, and they're quoting Psalm 22, verse 8. These events are taking place between the 6th and the 9th hour. That's between noon and 3 in the afternoon. And between noon and 3 in the afternoon, when the sun is the highest in the sky, everything is dark like night. That in itself should have said something to the people who were there. That in itself should have been a sign that God has sent darkness upon the earth, because this is a dark act, a dark deed. But their hatred of Jesus is such that nothing deters them. And then Jesus says this thing, and he says it in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. He's not quoting the modern language for his day, the Aramaic Targum, the Aramaic translation of Psalm 22, verse 1. He's quoting it directly from the Hebrew of David in the Psalm. Psalm 22, verse 1. Psalm 22, verse 1 begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? I've heard preachers get awfully melodramatic about this verse and say things that I don't know we can say from the text. That God in that moment has turned his back on Jesus, that God abandoned Jesus to the fires of hell for a period of time. And we're not told any of that in Scripture. We're not. Jesus is quoting the opening line of a song that the people who were taunting him had quoted, word for word. I know Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? But read Psalm 21 like I asked you to yesterday. And it's clear that in the beginning of that song, that's exactly the way David feels, because of the way he's being exposed to hardship and suffering. But by the end of the song and throughout the song, there are these waves of faith in God, hope in God, trust in God, which are by the end of the song vindicated. And the good news about God's triumph is then shared with the world. This is a song that begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? But it ends in triumph. And when Jesus says the opening lines of that song, I think he's reminding himself and us to read that song. It's a song they would have known. It's a song they could have sung themselves. And he's giving them the opening line of a song. If I had very little voice, but I said, should old acquaintance be forgotten, never brought to mind, or I said, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, you'd know what I was reminding you of. And Jesus is saying the opening lines of this psalm. And it's a sacred moment, It's a sacred moment because we have it in the Hebrew. We have it in the very words that Jesus uses when he says it. And because the gospel writers, multiple gospel writers, preserve it for us, it's important for us to know that when Jesus was on the cross, that in the middle of them taunting him, their very taunts took him to the passage of Scripture that sang of his deliverance, that empathized with everything he was going through and expressed it to us, to them, and then ended with God's deliverance. I think this is not a statement that God had forsaken Jesus, but that God had not forsaken Jesus. Read the Psalm, Psalm 22. That's what Jesus, I think, is asking us to do when he says this. They think he's saying Elijah. He's saying this in Hebrew and not the Aramaic that they would have been speaking. That might have been an issue. He has not much voice. We've already talked about the strangulation, the asphyxiation that he was, suffocation that he was experiencing, and then just the weakness from the beating. But they think he's talking about Elijah, and they say, well, let's see if Elijah will come save him now. And that's really all we have about Jesus on the cross from Matthew's Gospel. We really get fewer details in Matthew's Gospel, though we get plenty of fulfillment of prophecy in it. We get fewer details than we do from the other Hebrew writers, but we do get this that we have from the other writers, and we have this detail that we get from John. They put wine, sour wine. That doesn't mean vinegar. I know I've had preachers say, but they put vinegar. The last insult was to give him vinegar to drink. Sour wine was sour, but it was the table wine of the common person. It was what they were used to drinking. I think somebody gave him a drink. And then it says, he yielded up his spirit with a loud voice. It's exactly the way that John communicates it in John 19. Jesus yielded up his own spirit when he had accomplished everything, when he was able to say, it is finished. Then he released life from his body. He released his eternal soul, his spirit, from the place it was residing, his physical body. And with that, he died. Now, what Matthew does tell us about was what happened in the aftermath. Details we have nowhere else. And we'll look at some of those details next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.